Hello, I'm Chief Warrant Officer 4 Vic Pinion, U.S. Navy retired, telling some stories of my naval career as I remember them. This one was while I was serving aboard the aircraft carrier John F. Kennedy CV-67 as the catapult arresting gear visual landing aids maintenance officer. And it deals with corrosion. That ship, by the way, was ultimately decommissioned as a result of massive corrosion, which was the result of underfunding maintenance by the higher authority and a whole bunch of other things, contributing factors. But this was, as I was first reported aboard the ship, in my initial walk-through inspection of the machinery, and Chief Neely, ABEC Neely, and ABEC Doug Cheney accompanied me through the whole division as I'm inspecting stuff. Both those Chief Petty Officers were fine Chief Petty Officers. They cared and they felt responsible affecting the entire division. And when I walked through the arresting gear, Chief Chris Paris accompanied me. He was the, not arresting gear, but the waist catapult chief. He accompanied me through that. And he cared very much. Very good Chief Petty Officer. And when I worked through the arresting gear chief, who was ABEC Sherwood, he accompanied me through the arresting gear. And a couple of the first class petty officers also accompanied me through the arresting gear. Well, one of the things I noticed in the catapults was many rusted balls of weld on the hydraulic piping, especially in the launch valve rooms. A lot of corrosion on that piping and big balls of weld where the piping had cracked over periods of time, and they'd be at sea operating and doing emergency repair, which meant simply weld the crack until it stopped leaking. Well, they never would correct those by replacing the section of piping or anything. It just, and those big balls of weld accumulated on the piping. Chief Cheney, the maintenance chief, was particularly proud of having a big, long section of hydraulic piping replaced for the number 2 catapult's jet blast deflector, which had been problem-prone, cracking and spraying hydraulic fluid all over the place. Well, this hydraulic fluid was Autosafe 271, which was then replaced by Autosafe 271, because 273, because the 271 would mutate, become a carcinogenic, and but then later they discovered that the replacement fluid was just as bad, if not worse. But I noticed that with that piping, and we talked about it, and they showed me in the ship's CSMP, which is the current ship's maintenance project, which is a listing of all of the jobs that need to be done but can't be done now for whatever reason, and for planning purposes for upcoming availabilities, like in a shipyard or in port or whatnot, for an overhaul period, install field changes and whatnot. In any case, they told me about this. Well, later on in the deployment, we had that piping would crack and spray this red hydraulic fluid all over the place and just fog up the spaces with it. I mean, the whole atmosphere is pink with the atomized hydraulic fluid. We breathed that stuff, and it was determined by some health people, I don't know who all they were, but that it was hazardous to breathe that stuff. Well, we'd been breathing it our whole careers. Like we'd been breathing asbestos fibers and jet fuel and jet exhaust and diesel fuel fumes and all kinds of stuff. And lead-based paint we'd used many times. You know, it was normal. Just give an idea of the things we know about nowadays, the hazardous things that were commonplace that we used back during my naval career. Cat 4 blew a union, in the piping in the launch valve room apart. It blew apart during a cat shot. Fortunately, it didn't blow apart until the airplane it was launching had enough airspeed to fly. But it sprayed this fluid out of about 1.5-inch diameter pipe all over that launch valve room, and just hundreds of gallons of it went in this launch valve room. And I discovered on investigating that the union nut and the thread piece were the two sections of pipe that screwed together, with this thread piece welded on one and the union nut on a nipple. They screwed together with an O-ring seal in the middle. Corrosion had reduced the thread's height in that union nut and on the thread piece. Both of them, it reduced them down to about half their original height. And with that on and tight, the pressure, sudden application of pressure to it, it had literally blown it apart. And this wasn't the first time that had happened. Well, we had in the supply system a split nut thing that you could put on there as an emergency fix while you're operating and enable you to continue operating. We installed that, and then we had another one blow apart on number 3 catapult, I believe it was. Either number 2 or 3, but another pipe blew apart. Same reason, corrosion. We later, and I remember the engineer's name from the Naval Air Engineering Center. He was down in Norfolk after we got back to the States, and the type commander, LDO officer of our technical specialty, had this civilian from the Naval Air Engineering Center to inspect those, and he determined that they were the wrong ones, and it was included in the job to replace that hydraulic piping, which the type commander officer, an LDO lieutenant, disapproved. He did not, he just left it deferred. He did not assign it to an accomplishing activity because it was a very expensive job to replace all of that piping. And he said, we'll have it inspected by the shipyard, and those that they determine needs to be replaced, then we'll replace it. Well, we got into the shipyard and they inspected it. They were not doing a thorough inspection. I got on them about that and had Chief Neely to escort them and watch them doing it and get a copy of the inspection report as soon as it came out. Well, guess what? It was determined that that piping, all of it, was only half the wall thickness of the piping, meaning less than 50% of the intended strength of that piping. So it was not strong enough to absorb the shock that it was exposed to with those pressures. And that's why it had been cracking and spraying this fluid around for years, possibly for the life of the ship. And it was 17 years old when I reported aboard. The ship had been having that problem for the life of the ship, as far as I could tell. And it had been causing the catapult, or the affected catapult, that had the problem with the cracking, spraying fluid, blowing apart union nuts. The catapult would be in a down status until they got it corrected, which caused having to take the airplane off that catapult and taxi it around and put it on a different catapult, which caused additional problems of moving airplanes around on a flight deck, whatnot, blowing people and things around, and taking longer for the launch series to be completed, which delayed the recovery of the previous launch, which delayed the respot, which delayed servicing the aircraft, getting ready for the next launch, and it's just a big ball rolling downhill. Well, we ultimately did get the most serious of that piping replaced. And I think I've told something about this in another story. So I'll let y'all go. Y'all carry on.